Welcome back to the show. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio revealed a comprehensive police reform plan aiming to eradicate a legacy of radicalized policing in the NYPD. The New York City Police Reform and Reinvention Collaborative draft plan includes 36 initiatives that are designed to make the NYPD more transparent, more accountable, and more effective. The plan comes before the deadline of April, in which the governor also ordered last summer, which required New York City and all localities within the state to create, pass, and enact a police reform program. On the national level, the House of Representatives also passed the George Floyd Justice Policing Bill of 2021. Democratic lawmakers are actually believing the legislation will reduce police violence against people of color, particularly Black Americans, while improving policing for everyone. The bill also came amid protests calling for an end to racial injustice and police brutality following the death of George Floyd at the hands of police in Minneapolis. We also are now joined in this show by sharing their point of view on the matter. I'm joined by the professor of Rutgers University-Newark and political strategist, Basil A. Smikle Jr. And we thank you so much, Professor Smikle, for joining us.
My pleasure. I'm glad to be here.
Let's get right at it right now. As we talk right now, we know that Derek Chauvin is facing charges in Minneapolis for that of the death of George Floyd. We know that nationwide, there's some police reform bills that have been going on. Talk to us about how you're viewing police reform in this season.
Well, of course, as you had mentioned earlier, it is in a response to a summer of unrest and protest and mobilization in the wake of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and the one-year anniversary of her killing was just over the weekend. So it's appropriate for us to be talking about these reform efforts in this season. And, you know, when we look at what's happening nationally, we saw other reforms being promoted and produced by the legislature in the last term under President Trump, but with the Democratic through the Democratic House, which really unfortunately didn't get as much traction because you had a different party in the Senate and certainly in the White House. So the expectation now that we have both a Democratic House and Senate and a Democratic president, that we'd be able to move some of these reforms more quickly. But I will tell you that one of the challenges, and it's a very important challenge, to making sure that a lot of the reforms that are promoted nationally actually have teeth and that they stick, is that when you look across the country, there are over 18,000 law enforcement agencies around the country. And because we have the system of federalism that we do, where so much autonomy rests at the state level, that it becomes really difficult for any national reforms to take hold, you know, in the streets, in the local jurisdictions, by the time all of that policy is filtered downward. So it's an important step. It's an important sort of overarching and umbrella piece of legislation. But the real challenge is how will it be implemented at the local level with so much fragmentation that we see across in our governance.
Yeah, but talk to me a little bit about this. When former President Donald Trump was in office, one of the first things he did was take out the Department of Justice's, or I should say the Civil Rights Office, right out of the White House. The Department of Justice not really doing enforcement in terms of these crimes. We understand that things are being handled on a state level. New president, new administration, new attorney general. Are you optimistic that with this federal charges possibly pending in several cases now, that we might see more federal activity, given the fact that there's been a change of a presidential administration?
I am quite optimistic. If you listen to Merrick Garland in his confirmation and in the subsequent comments after that, you really do get the sense that this will be a very different Department of Justice. It will be both accountable and it will be independent, and it will have the offices and the officers that will be able to handle these and adjudicate these matters quite quite effectively. And I think you raise a very important point that when Donald Trump took office, he, in basically every agency across the federal government, took out any offices, bureaus, branches that enforced and oversaw protections for people of color, for women, for members of the LGBTQ community. And as we now see President Biden in his first few weeks and months in office, if you really think about what he's been doing, he's essentially been rolling back a lot of what Donald Trump did. He's actually been putting some of these offices back, restoring these positions to their full strength and authority. And that's very important as these cases are looked at across the country. And even when you have differences in political party leading local jurisdictions or states, you can have some comfort that the Department of Justice will at least be a somewhat independent office that will look at these issues much more carefully and with less of a partisan eye.
Yeah. Talk to me about locally. I mean, here in New York City, of course, we know the mayor's got a police reform plan. How are we seeing police reform playing out throughout New York City?
Well, I can tell you, it's, I grew up in the Bronx. I'm a kid of the Bronx. And, growing up as a young man, I was afraid of the police because of all that I heard and all that I experienced or other friends of mine experienced. But I would also tell you that my grandmother had a strong hand in raising me. And every time she went out to the store, I wanted to make sure, I hope that she had came back safe and that she was protected and that the streets were safe. So I think that if I just say that and lay that out at the top, I think that's the important point to be made here, which I say is whenever there's something wrong in my neighborhood or my community, the police are the first I want to call, but I don't want them to be the last people that I see. So yes, I want them to be accountable. And I think the mayor's proposal does create more accountability, being able to see more history, more extended history of police officers' record, and is very important in getting a full picture. Giving the CCRB more teeth, is incredibly helpful. But there are other things that I think we have to talk about and are a bit more pervasive. That is the role that union contracts play in how in what the mayor can and cannot do in terms of enforcement. Just if you think about Eric Garner, the case of Eric Garner, and that we were, there were so many people across the country that didn't really understand how the mayor just couldn't fire Officer Pantaleo just at will. But of course, the rules, the contracts don't suggest that. So we still need to have real conversations about what can and cannot be done through the union contracts and how those can be negotiated or renegotiated. We also need to talk as well about some of the other influences with respect to police officers. And I hear this often from even police officers that I have in some of my classes, that, if we want them to live in New York City, if we want New York City police officers to live within the 5 boroughs of New York City, many of them leave because they feel that New York is unaffordable. They can't, based on their salary, they can't actually afford to live here. So they go find cheaper housing in some of our suburban communities or ex-urban communities. That has to be addressed. Even something like education, how many credits would be required to join the police academy, or once you finish, how many credits do you need to have under your belt? What kind of classes do you need to take? And that's also quite important, because if you look at something like classes on racial sensitivity, a lot of that happens in the police academy, but or even after officers leave the academy for the sort of additional training. But a lot of officers who are in my classes tell me that, by the time it gets to that point, it doesn't really get internalized. Maybe we should be requiring more of that, or some of that, or more of that, when these officers are taking those college credits or in college. So I think even exploring curriculum, it becomes that much more important as well. So there are other pieces that I think are helpful and important to these kind of larger reform efforts, but I think it's a good first step.
Yeah. And for those who don't know, you're a professor at Rutgers Newark, and as you mentioned, you talked about dealing with police officers as students in the classroom. Give me that, because as you're saying, uh, talking to these officers and having that conversation, it seems as though when you talk about racial sensitivity, they feel as though it comes in too late. And probably the better is when we're recruiting you and we're putting you through the initial, this is what you need to have, rather than letting me be out on the street for 10 years and already developing my own culture and biases. Am I hearing that correct?
Well, no, yeah, I'm sorry. It is interesting because I also co-teach. I do teach at Rutgers, and I co-teach a class at Columbia University with the Attorney General Tish James on rethinking policing, and I've had a number of law enforcement members of law enforcement in New York City and elsewhere, some in federal and some even from other countries who are in that class. And I've had members of NYPD in my other classes at Columbia as well, and in Newark, and Rutgers Newark. And so when they they have some very, I treat my classes like a safe space, so everybody can talk and say what's on their mind and don't feel like they would be talked down to or condescended to, because we really want a full discussion about issues. And when some of these officers, speak, they feel that one of the big challenges to doing the right thing, if you will, is the peer pressure, is the culture of the department. It is the rigidity of some of the rules. But what's interesting is that when we think about police officers on the ground, they actually do have a tremendous amount of discretion. There's a book by Lipsky called Street Level Bureaucrats that talks a lot about how people, police officers, teachers, and others, they're government workers, but they have a tremendous amount of discretion in their day-to-day jobs. But even with that, a lot of officers, particularly the younger rank and file officers, feel this need to assimilate into a certain type of culture. Which may prevent them from speaking up. It may prevent them from, changing course, making different decisions on the ground when they're faced in certain situations. And so you really do get to start to understand some of the day-to-day pressures that these officers face. So something like the challenges of finding affordable housing in a city like New York, when their salary really can't cover rent, or it makes it difficult to be able to pay rent and raise a family, even something like that. You really hear from a lot of the officers, and you really get a sense of what the city, from a city perspective, what we might be able to do to be helpful. But also, if you think about who they are as people, you start to think about ways in which you can create public policies to sort of impact and affect their lives. And I'll just say very quickly, if you look at other jurisdictions as well, this has happened before. There are a lot of teachers, for example, in other jurisdictions that get support and aid for their housing so that they can live, within those sort of school districts or jurisdictions. So there are a lot of places around the country that have housing, or subsidized housing, if you will, for teachers. Should we be thinking more about that with respect to police officers, to get them to live within these 5 boroughs and sort of address a lot of the concerns that activists have had about making sure that the officers have a kind of local accountability.
Yeah. Gonna take a quick break and come back more with Professor Basil Smikle when we return here on the Social Justice Forums. We'll be right back in a second, right after this.
We built a media network for you.
BronxNet TV.
Come learn in your new state-of-the-art studios at Lehman College.
At Mercy College.
And coming soon to the South Bronx in the Hub.
Inspire with your stories, culture, history.
Your Bronx on BronxNet.
Engage with us.
Connect with us at your channels and at bronxnet.tv.
Learn, engage, inspire. BronxNet TV.
From the Bronx
to the world.
BronxNet.
We're back here on the show, continuing our conversation with Professor Basil Smikle, talking about police reform, talking about New York City, talking about the state, and also, listen, national and international. The issues, they remain the same, the locale, no matter where you are. It seems as though everybody's dealing with the same thing, the same issues. And the question is, how do we actually address? And so, Professor Smikle, let's go a little bit further. Before the break, we were talking a little bit about the work that you're doing. Talk to us about, where you are, and you say you teach at Rutgers, but also not Rutgers, but also Columbia.
Yeah, that's right. I've been a professor, an adjunct at Columbia which is where I got my doctorate. I've been and my doctorate's in education and politics, but I've been teaching a class in the School of Public Affairs, which is where I got my master's as well, on public sector marketing, planning, and communications. I teach a class, I co-teach the class, as I mentioned, with the Attorney General of New York State, Tish James, on rethinking policing. And then Rutgers, I teach at the School of Public Affairs Administration, different classes on public policy and research methods and nonprofits.
Yeah. So when you talk about rethinking policing, let's stay there for a second, talk a little bit about that conversation. What's it like
Sure.
To be able to have that conversation with police officers? I, work with them on a frequent basis, and I hear from them, boots on the ground, morale is low. Don't really want to have these conversations because morale is low and everything is bad, bad, bad. But the reality is the majority feel as though, we're not that number. So talk to me about what are you hearing? What are you feeling?
Yeah, I know. I hear the same things, that morale is quite low. The police officers themselves say they want to be better. They want to do better. They want better relationships with the community. You would find that a lot of them do go out of their way to have really good relationships in the community. If you look at New York City specifically, you'll see, that there are precinct community councils, which are designed to have strong relationships between police precincts and local community leaders and residents. So there, and if you go back to even the Dinkins administration, he wanted to have a stronger, he was asking for more police officers, but those police officers largely were going to be redeployed or deployed in such a way that there would be a stronger relationship with communities. So we can have conversations about, do we need more police? Do we need fewer police? But it's also about how we deploy them. And, one of the things that's really interesting is if you go back and, think about CompStat, which is that statistical, which is that program, that sort of process whereby law enforcement agencies can track crimes and how, depending on the crimes that are sort of included in this, they can track crimes geographically and figure out how to redeploy officers in certain areas. But one of the things we don't do is use that same kind of technique to track, quality of life crimes, quality of life violations, if you will, or changes in quality of life. We don't use it necessarily to track when officers do good things in the community. And that's something that I hear from a lot of the officers as well. And so there is a need to change. They realize it. Of course, we on the community side have been feeling it for decades. But if I think in terms of their morale, I hear it from the officers all the time.
Yeah. One of the things that's being discussed right now is deployment. When we have situations where you have a person that has mental issues, the question is, should a police officer actually be deployed for a 911 call when it's in regards to that? Or are we seeing more of, as it was a proposal, of having mental health professionals actually be deployed, because this could possibly mitigate loss of life and injury?
Well, you might need both, right? Because there may be situations where the person might be violent and the police officer will need to be on hand to help diffuse, de-escalate that situation. But also, we have to also recognize that there are people who are trained professionals in this area that may have an ability to do that as well, not by any use of force, but by words, by other actions that they're taking that can help diffuse or de-escalate situations. So I think police officers will tell you the same thing, that there are a lot of situations that they're called in to intervene in, and they don't either feel that they shouldn't be there, like they don't need to be called for such incidences, or that they could have someone with them that is more trained to handle these situations, so that they don't have to be the sort of the tip of the spear, if you will, that they can be there in a support capacity and have someone else who is trained with in the areas of mental health to be there and sort of take the lead on how to, as I said, diffuse or de-escalate situations. So the police officers themselves will tell you that there needs to be a change in the kinds of calls that they're being asked to show up at, and how they act in those moments. But certainly that's an important conversation that needs to take place, and I'm glad to see that in some areas it certainly is taking place, especially as well as it is here in New York City.
Yeah. A lot of public controversy about when you see a situation, such as the George Floyd situation. You've got the family of George Floyd. We know that they'll receive a $27 million payout in the civil suit. This while the criminal trial is going forward. Your thoughts about that? When you hear people say, listen, the civil suit is the family's way of selling out before the verdict is even there, not believing that the verdict is going to go in their favor. We know there's a lot more to it than just that. So can you kind of like deconstruct that a little bit?
Sure.
for public understanding?
Sure. Listen, you don't want to, and I think we have to be careful here, just as the general public, not to castigate the family, not to throw stones at them, not to come to conclusions about why they made the decisions that they made. This is a very tough time for them, and they have to make decisions about what's good for themselves, what's good for the family. One of the key takeaways for me is that as this is proceeding through its criminal phase, the family needs to make sure that they feel some sense of justice, whether they can get that in monetarily, or they can get that in terms of a criminal trial. They deserve the right to feel some sense of closure, or if not closure, then justice. And we should not take that away from anybody. People will feel it and receive it in very different ways. But I think there's this sort of larger point about accountability that certainly is important here, because as we think about that number, what is it, $27 million? Just think about how much cities, municipalities pay out in restitution, and when they pay families who've lost loved ones or who have been victimized by police brutality. What if we put some of that funding, probably a fraction of it, into some of the training and supports and redesigning of departments at the front end? Because it probably will cost municipalities less to actually have this in place beforehand, as opposed to at the back end, when you're having to pay out money because you have officers who probably shouldn't have been in the department in the first place, or should have been asked to leave or fired long before they committed this act. And so these are things that we have to really think very carefully about. And I believe that activists and advocates for police reform have been doing it for quite some time. And unfortunately, because of the death of George Floyd, we are revisiting it in a very real way.
Yeah. We talk a little bit about, well, not a little bit, we talk a lot about hesitancies presently in this communities of color, when it comes to the COVID-19 vaccine and taking the COVID-19 vaccine. And we understand, traditionally there has been this hesitancy due to Tuskegee experiment, the healthcare disproportions, and so on. I want to talk about another kind of hesitancy, and that hesitancy is amongst communities of color, particularly African Americans, in getting involved and joining and being employed by law enforcement. We see an apathy when it comes to becoming part of law enforcement and joining law enforcement. Talk to me about what you see and how we can break that down. Because as I've instructed people on many occasions when I've had a conversation with young people, that the greatest way that you can affect change is from within. Sometimes you can affect it without, but definitely to change can be affected from within.
Well, I think that's really important, and it's sort of part of the formula, but perhaps not the whole formula. I mean, if you look at, I believe in the case of George Floyd, the police commissioner was African American, if I believe. And you do have in New York City, I think in New York City, there are a very large percentage of officers are of color, not perhaps not as much as they should be, but certainly much more than it has been. What is interesting is that if you then look at the higher ranks, captains and sergeants, lieutenants, captains, and higher ups in the department, that's where you really see a dearth of diversity. So while we do have diversity within the department in terms of the rank and file officers, the upper echelons of power within the department are still predominantly white and substantially so. So I do think that representation is important, but representation across ranks and throughout the department is also incredibly important. I think you're starting to see that now in the New York City department, some changes even within the last few weeks, but I still think there needs to be more substantial, pervasive change. So there's that. But I would also say that we also have to look at the other things that are impacting this. You know, when we talked about things like housing, that's a challenge as a result of wages. So, you know, are we attracting more folks of color? Could we attract more folks of color if we paid, you know, if we raise the wage a bit as well? Because you have a lot of folks like me who came from very modest homes and want to be able to earn a salary and be able to move quickly through sort of wage levels to be able to take care of yourself and your family and create some kind of intergenerational wealth for ourselves. You may not be able to do that. Many may not be able to do that if you have, you know, a wage that doesn't even enable you to rent an apartment in New York City. And so maybe some of that would make a difference. But I would also say, quite frankly, that there are other ways that people of color can be involved in affecting change in law enforcement. I go back to a comment that I make all the time about prosecutors in this country. Of the over 2,500 elected prosecutors in this country, 95% of them are white, 95%. So when you think about that, those prosecutors who have discretion across the country about what to charge, what to recommend in terms of sentencing, even as we talk about criminal justice reform, we can't have a conversation about that without thinking about the prosecutors themselves, who, as I said, are 95% white. So if you're going to affect change, who's affecting that change? And there are ways, most of these are positions that are elected, and not everybody's going to run for office. But there are many other avenues that people can take to affect change in the law enforcement community, if not just being a police officer himself or herself.
Yeah. So before we get finish with our conversation, I want to get opportunity for you to share some thoughts, particularly when we talk about just that, right? We talk about prosecutors, we talk about sentencing and sentencing guidelines, and political process. Are you finding, given the current state of affairs now, that there is more engagement from a political level? Because when you talk about the police department, you know, we know the whole thing. Everything is political. Police department, your sanitation, everything. Are you seeing more local engagement in the area of being politically active?
So absolutely, I think we are in an era right now where there is a substantial amount of political engagement and mobilization. It's different from when I was growing up and maybe my parents and relatives were younger, where even my parents came from Jamaica, but even there or here in the U.S. during the civil rights movement, when you had, you know, a number of leaders, you know, the Black church was central to a lot of that mobilization. It still is. But what we're also finding is that social media in many ways has small d democratized the movements, so that there isn't one leader, there isn't one local leader or one national leader, that everyone can step up and lead. And you've seen that happen over and over and over again, certainly within the last 10 years, but or just fewer with social media, but within the last year, you've seen that substantially. So what I'm encouraged about, or what I'm encouraged by, is that there are so many young people who are just moved to action, and that there is across the board realization that elections have consequences. And so even if you come out of New York and you look at some place like Ithaca, New York, which is where I went to college, undergrad at Cornell, very small town, it was like 30,000 people, but the kind of college is probably half of that. And you have a young mayor who's an African-American, a guy named Savante Merrick, really young. I don't know if he's even 40 yet. But he has come out with a decision recently to basically disband his police department and start from scratch and implement a lot of the reforms that we've been talking about and others have been talking about. Now, I think there's only 4% African American population there. They probably also, most of those probably actually go to Cornell as well. So it's a largely white community and a very small community. So it doesn't have the diversity of and the size of a place like New York. It doesn't have the income diversity that New York City has.
Well, we want to thank you for coming and being with us and sharing your expertise here on the Social Justice Forums. Glad to have you with us, Dr. Basil Smikle. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
All righty. Listen, I want you to stay with us. We have more show. We are going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more coming up right after this.